everyone. Today we are gathered here for a commemorative lecture to celebrate 100 years of one of the most epic poems of modernism, P.S. Eliot's The Wasteland.
We welcome you all to this lecture session conducted by the Research and Postgraduate Department of English and Literary Club of the College.
Prof R Indulal, former Associate Professor of English, St. College, is an avid reader, seasoned scholar and a skilled orator. He has served the college for more than 30 years. His areas include cultural studies and literary theory. Currently, he is Additional Private Secretary to the Hon'ble Minister of Higher Education and Social Justice, Government of Kerala. We are so fortunate to have such a great teacher with us to talk on one of the exemplary works of modernism. We are looking forward to you, sir.
Respected Principal in Charge and Head of Department, Dr. Saraswathy, my dear colleagues of my erstwhile service here, Vasida, Krishnan, Tomi, Leena, and the present group of teachers who probably lead the students to a better learning than old-fashioned dinosaurs like me in the department. The youngest generation especially, I'm very happy to see most of them because some of them were not here when I was here, and they are probably adding a lot of young blood to the department. Hopefully the department is not bleeding, but at least, okay. And very dear students of this college. When I was a teacher in the PG classes, I used to take roughly 6 months or more than that to talk about the wasteland. I don't know how I'm going to manage to talk about this poem in a short period of time. But of course, that's also part of the game because this was a poem that started out as a long epic and ended up being a very short poem. So maybe summarizing, cutting into pieces is also part of the skill that you need when you talk about Eliot. Well, this is a painting. You are probably familiar with it. Are you? It is Marcel Duchamp, nude descending the stair. Well, if you are going to look for the nude, you will be definitely disappointed because you don't see the nude very much there. But this is how a modern painter saw the human body in action. Because if you want to portray the nude descending the stair, well, in this particular painting, actually Duchamp painted many versions of the painting. In this particular painting you cannot see the stair, but in the first version 1, you can even see the stair. The stair is there. But there is nothing to stare in it because, the nude is not there. But the nude is still there. You can see the body. It's a continuous motion from one of the top rungs of the staircase towards the end of the staircase, the landing. Okay. Three musicians. One of the games that we used to play when I was a student was to find out all the three musicians in the painting. It is roughly difficult, but at least you can see all the three musical instruments. Even if you can't see the, you can see the clarinet or whatever, you can see the guitar, all the, instruments are there, and then you look for the musicians if you want, if you are so very particular about it. Salvador Dali persistence of memory. Very famous painting. Most of you have already said this. You can see the watches that are fluid, because when we think about time, when we think about memory, remember it's always fluid. It's never a very clear-cut time that we remember. When you remember something, it continuously changes. It's always in a flux. So Dali probably felt that time was something that was in a flux, and therefore it had to have a clock that was not exactly of a very, very definite shape, but something that was fluid in its character. I'll show you something that's very different. Well, this is definitely Renaissance. Botticelli, The Birth of Venus. Look at the face of the Venus. Look at the face of all the human characters who are portrayed there, with what loving detail the painter has actually painted there. Right? The body is completely there. Initially, the critics were critical of Botticelli because they said there is no proportion, because somehow the legs of Venus are too long for the torso or something like that. And then they discovered that this was a painting of Venus, not a human being. So the Venus is so large that when you look at that person, if you're a human being, you might be looking up. And when you look up, remember the legs are definitely longer and the torso looks shorter. So there is a kind of shortening of the body that Botticelli has characteristically painted, because he wanted us to look at the painting from below. Not at par with the painting, not on the same level, but he was making us look at the painting from below, because you are looking at a goddess, not a human being. So look at the details that a Renaissance painter is bothered about. The details that he brings into the painting of the body. The body is so perfect, the body is so very well proportioned. They are looking at maybe the human figure as if it's a very important object. But compare it with the three musicians, where the human body is not even seen. If at all it is there, it is seen in triangles and squares, because this was called cubism, remember? And look at Marcel Duchamp, who was actually not even worried about the human body, but the human body was something that was in movement. It is the movement that the painter is trying to portray. I say this because at the time of Renaissance, we established a particular kind of human body and humanness that stayed in the world for almost 6 centuries. But at the beginning of 20th century, it was this outlook, this perspective that was challenged. This very perspective of the Renaissance human body, the Renaissance kind of shape, the Renaissance shape of the world was challenged because it was no longer valid. Or at least it was something that was in disintegration, in the mode of disintegration. So that disintegration at the beginning of 20th century became primarily important for any artist to paint, or any poet to write about, any novelist to write about, and naturally they were looking more at the conscious and unconscious mind rather than the body. So instead of a physical world to narrate about, instead of a physical world to think about and talk about, now they were looking at a set of human beings who were not probably bodies, but probably just minds. And what kind of minds? Minds that were probably not visible, because quite a lot of that mind was unconscious. Sigmund Freud had already talked about the unconscious. We knew there was a large part of the human mind that is not visible, that is not available for perception, and therefore naturally something that was out of our normal understanding. Now that human being, the person who is out of our normal understanding, the person who is not visible for our perception, The person who is actually someone who is constantly in flux, constantly changing, not, constituted by the body, by the physical dimensions of the body. That person became the central figure in 20th century literature. Look at fiction, for example. 1922 is not only the year of The Wasteland, it is also the year of Ulysses, written by James Joyce. It was also the year of Ezra Pound's very famous cantos. So actually it was an year in which, 1922 was an year in which, in a way, the human perception was recorded in a very, very different manner. When Joyce started writing the Ulysses, for him the character or the characters in the novel were no longer definite human beings, they were streams of consciousness. Right? There were streams of consciousness. There is this wonderful story about how Joyce was writing Finnegan's Wake, and Samuel Beckett, you have heard of him definitely because he was also a British dramatist. Samuel Beckett was the person who was writing it down, scribe. At that time they were living in Paris, and Joyce was busy dictating the novel Finnegan's Wake. While Beckett was writing, somebody knocked on the door, and without stopping to narrate, Joyce said, "Come in." Without realizing this was actually a direction to somebody who was knocking on the door, Beckett, who was very busy writing down, also wrote that sentence down. Later, Beckett was asked to read what he had written to Joyce. Joyce heard this come in the midst of a sentence, and he asked, "What is that?" Beckett said, "You said this." Joyce said, "Okay, let it stay. No problem." Right? A particular sentence or a word was not something that was predetermined. It was something that was determined by the time in which it was created. It didn't matter whether Joyce had already preconceived a sentence like, "Come in" or not. What mattered was Joyce at that particular time had thought about it. Right? Joyce at that particular time had in his consciousness the word "come in," and therefore it suddenly became part of the novel Finnegan's Wake. So you can see how a person's very fluid memory and thought, a person's mind, the unconscious, a person's stream of consciousness or whatever, suddenly becomes the person rather than the human body. So the Venus is no longer available to us. We can't look at the Venus anymore because the body of Venus is disintegrated. It's not available. What is available is a human being who is constantly in flux, who is continuously changing, who is probably available only in a consciousness that is not a finished product at all. So the human being is in process mode now. Not in kind of product mode, but in process mode now. It is this human being who had to be narrated. This human being who had to be told in stories, who had to be described in stories. So naturally you needed new techniques, new narrative strategies, and obviously the modernist literature, whether you are talking about poetry or novel or drama or whatever, they started looking for new strategies to talk about this. But how can you make people realize things have changed? One obvious technique that you need is shock. You have to shock them. Right? You have to make them see things differently by shocking them. And Eliot was a master of the shocking technique. He was probably someone who could shock other people much better than others. Remember a poem like the Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, right? Look at the title of the poem, Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. J. Alfred Prufrock, with a with an initial, with a very, very official looking name, not a lover, but a person who suddenly appears to have come out of a resume or probably a curriculum vitae or something like that. A person who prints his name in bold letters at the top of the CV or resume. That's the kind of person J. Alfred Prufrock is. He's such a very down-to-earth, ordinary, very normal person, in the sense abnormal is now normal. Remember, the very normal person of 20th century, that his love story cannot be normal anymore. So, it's a poem that is called a dramatic monologue, remember? And when you read dramatic monologues, think about them, you think about wonderful love poems and so on, or poems about love at least. But here is a love poem that begins, let's go then you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky, like a patient etherized upon a table. Right? The sky is not red. The sky is not like the cheeks of a shy lover, right? With blush, soft blush on it or anything like that. But it is actually the face of or the body of a patient etherized upon a table. What is so different? What is different is the very image that Eliot brings in. Etherized is a word that could not have been used by a romantic poet, because the technique of using ether in order to make somebody unconscious lying on an operating table was a modern scientific technique. So here is suddenly a poet talking about a contemporary reality, talking about something that's possible only in 20th century, and talking about an experience that probably is one of the most famous and maybe age-old experiences that have been continuously described by poems all over the world. Love, remember, is the most famous theme in poetry. And it's a love song that suddenly says, you are almost like a patient etherized upon a table. So a patient etherized upon a table suddenly becomes the kind of image that shocks ordinary human being out of normal, ordinary perception. You cannot look at love anymore as a very, very pleasant romantic experience, but love is something like a very modern experience that happens in the modern world, the world of ether, the world of new medical experiences. So what you call the discourse has suddenly changed. The discourse is that of modern medicine, the discourse is suddenly that of, let us say, modernity at its height. That's what happens here. When in the wasteland, somebody waits. Probably if you have read the poem very carefully, you might remember this. Somebody waits. The human engine waits like a taxi throbbing, waiting. Waiting is no longer the normal experience of a bird, like maybe a hornbill waiting for the rain to come. Not anymore the normal natural experiences, but waiting is now an experience of a taxi throbbing, waiting. Well, I don't know whether you have personal experience of taxi throbbing, waiting, but you have definitely personal experience of auto rickshaws throbbing, waiting. Right? Imagine yourself getting into a shop after contracting an auto rickshaw and taking too much time for buying something. Then what will happen to the auto rickshaw driver? The driver will honk his horns continuously and probably raise the engine once or twice, and there will be a throbbing and waiting for the auto rickshaw continuously until you turn up. Okay? An entirely modern experience. The experience of the taxi throbbing, waiting is now dovetailed to, connected to an experience of love. Now, love is no longer like a red rose, it's like an auto rickshaw. Right? How many of you, while contracting an auto rickshaw or getting into an auto rickshaw, have thought of auto rickshaw as a future possible symbol of love? That is precisely what happens. Well, I remember watching a drama which was actually presented by Calicut University Little Theatre. It was called Mayvilasam. And in that particular play, a lover who is actually the Inspector General who comes to investigate a crime that was at that time happening in the government. He comes there and falls in love with the daughter of the municipal chairman. You know, it happened in a municipality. Falls in love with the municipal chairman, and the municipal chairman's daughter pretends to have no love for him for some time just in order to make him more and more, desirous, because desire comes when you deny, remember, that's a lesson that will be very useful. Desire comes when you deny, and obviously this particular person was pretending to deny this girl, and then the lover suddenly presents him with a jackfruit. Chakka. Because he was trying to make a present, to give some present, love present. He forgot to bring anything that was valuable, not a rose or something like that, which would stand for eternal love. Because my love, remember, is like a red rose, and that love is no longer available, and therefore this person presents his future lady love with a chakka. And obviously the chakka suddenly becomes a symbol of love. It was a play called Male Vilasam. I remember how the whole, the play was based on Gogol's play, Inspector General. Inspector General, it was actually a Russian play, it was translated into Malayalam. And chakka, which is a typically Malayalam object, became part of the play, I remember. So this chakka is suddenly presented to the young girl as a token of love, right? My love is no longer like a red rose, but my love is now like a chakka, and that suddenly becomes very, very significant for the play. So what I am trying to say, what was I trying to say? Taxi throwing, waiting. Right. Okay. So very modern experience. Look at what was happening. Maybe a person who was writing this poem in the early 19th century would never have written a line like this. It was not possible, because a person in the 19th century could not have come up with this experience. This experience is available only for a 20th century poet, because that's what happens in 20th century, and only a 20th century poet can write about this. So this is the kind of, let us say, poetry that suddenly happens in 20th century. And what I am trying to say is, and I'll use this, otherwise I might go off track. Well, he wrote a poem of, these details they have already given you. In October 1922, the poem was published in the Criterion. In November 1922, it was published in the Dial. And in December, it was brought out as a book with a lot of notes. They wanted to publish it in the form of a book, The Wasteland. And obviously, it contained only 17 or 18 pages. And you cannot publish a book that has only 17 or 18 pages. So Eliot was asked to write something to add to the book. And he wrote a few notes, which actually grew into a much larger size than the poem itself, and became one of the greatest dangerous aspects of the book from that time onwards. He wrote notes that ran to almost close to 60 pages, and published the book in 1922. And that book was obviously published from New York by Bonney and Liverite. Now, these people, this particular poem is something that suddenly changed the very way we looked at reality. Not because things had not already started happening. Remember, things had already started happening. We can talk about modernism. Modernism had already started. Modernism was a radical break. At the end of the 19th century, they wanted to break away from all conventions and traditions that existed until that particular period of time. One of the places where they wanted to bring this difference was with narrative. Remember, The Wasteland is a narrative poem. It's an epic, and normally you would call it a long narrative poem. It is 400 odd lines long, 430, 31, 32 or whatever, you can't say. Originally it was 433 according to Eliot's count, but because Eliot had not listened very carefully in his mathematics classes, Originally there are 434 lines. So obviously you can see how it's not a very long poem. But at the same time, this is a poem that marks a change, a very radical break. When a radical break happens, remember, things are suddenly completely transformed into something very new, something very, very different. So poetry could not be looked at as we used to look at poetry earlier. Things completely changed. The way in which we understood images, understood narrative itself started changing, because this was originally a poem that was written in more than 800 lines, and a terrible person called Ezra Pound had his scissors operating on it, and after all the activities that he conducted, it came out as a 433, 4, 6 or whatever line poem, and Ezra Pound called himself Ezra performed the Caesarean, he said, right, to bring the poem out. So the Caesarean was rather painful, definitely, because he had cut out most of the lines, right, most of the lines. Poem that had actually a section that had more than 400 lines suddenly became a section of 10 lines, which is the fourth section of the poem called Death by Water. Originally it had more than 400 lines. Eliot had written 400 lines, and Ezra Pound discovered that those 400 lines were not needed. Think about the friend who was actually a foe, but a friend can always be a foe, remember. Now, one of the strategies the poem uses is that of subversion. Subverting masters, subverting available masters. How does the poem begin? April is the cruelest month. Reading lilacs out of the dead land, stirring, mixing memory and desire, stirring down roots with spring rain. Now, why is the poet beginning like that? You know it is because one that April with his shorter suit, the drought of March its berserk to the road is the way Chaucer's Canterbury Tales begins. So, if a poem like the Canterbury Tales begins like this, which was the beginning of English epic poetry, remember? Here is a 20th century epic poem that begins by putting the whole thing upside down. Because April is no longer sweet, it is the cruelest time. So subversion, subverting what already exists is the strategy that Eliot wants to use at this particular point of time. He doesn't stop there, he also subverts Shakespeare, because those are two wonderful masters who are very useful for subversion, very easily available, and whenever you subvert, remember, subvert the most important, because only then can your subversion be sufficiently important. So subvert Chaucer, because he is the father of English poetry. If you want to do something, hit at the father. That is the best, right? Hit at the father. So he started by hitting at the father, then he hit the next one, the eldest in the family, Shakespeare, and started hitting them one by one. Because he was trying to change the tradition and prove that he was changing the tradition. All through a narrative medium. Right? Because he was trying to problematize all the certainties that supported or that existed in the social organization, in religion, in morality, in the conception of the human self itself. Right? There were certainties, there were shapes that were available. The human being was completely available until the 19th century. We knew who we were at that time. Whenever we talked about ourselves, it was as if we had a self and we were proud of that self. We could talk about ourselves. We were always having a name of our own and so on. But then Freud came and said, 90% of yourself is actually unconscious. Why is the unconscious unconscious? Because you are unconscious about it. So you cannot talk about it anyway. The unconscious is unconscious because it is not conscious. Right? Not because it is something, but because it is not something. Unconscious is typically defined negatively. It can only be defined negatively. It cannot be something that is positive, that is something because it is not something. It is there because it is not there. It's there only as long as you are unaware of its presence. You cannot speak about it. The moment you speak about it, remember it is conscious, and therefore it is no longer the unconscious. The unconscious is a very, very peripheral existence, deep within you, and if you can think about your own unconscious, that means it is no longer unconscious. So, suddenly, the unconscious became a very important factor of our selfhood. The unconscious became a very important factor that defined us, because quite a large portion of our self was actually our unconscious. And by definition, you could not talk about it. So, who are you? You are this large, dark mass that you cannot talk about, and if you can talk about, that means you are not talking about it at all. You are talking about something else. This reality, the reality that is constantly in flux and constantly unavailable, this reality is what suddenly makes a painter like Duchamp paint the nude descending the stair as something that completely questions our sense of reality, questions our images of the nude. Well, if you have looked at Renaissance paintings, you might have looked at a lot many nude paintings, including Botticelli's very famous painting of the Birth of Venus, which we have already looked at. Well, they were nude figures, and the Renaissance characteristically specialized in painting nude human figures because they were studying the human body at that time. Remember, Leonardo da Vinci was a student of anatomy. He had already exhumed dead bodies and operated upon them in order to see how the dead body is constituted. And this was also a time when human body was studied very, very thoroughly and very, methodically, systematically, almost for the use of medicine and also for the use of painting. So painters studied human anatomy by looking at the human body, and naturally they had their own ideas about anatomy which got represented in Renaissance painting. That is not to be seen in modern paintings at all. Modern painting suddenly problematized the whole thing, questioned the very reality of the human body and represented the human body as we have already seen in the case of the nude descending the stair. So contrast the nude in a Botticelli painting or in a painting by Raphael or in a painting by any of the Renaissance painters with the nude in Duchamp. The reality is very different. The reality cannot be the old kind of reality anymore. So we are looking at a world that is now perceived differently, that is to be seen very differently. It is a world that suddenly has gone into process mode rather than product mode. You are looking at the nude descending the stair, not the nude who is standing on the stair. That's a problem. It is the act of descent that is being portrayed, not the nude herself or himself. I don't know whether it's a girl or a boy. I don't know whether even Marshal Duchamp was very worried about it, because he was just talking about the nude anyway. So nude is descending the stair, and the word descending is very, very important because it is a painting that tries to portray the act of descending the stair rather than the nude. So if you wanted to look at the nude to satisfy some other vicarious pleasure, then you are definitely in for disappointment because you are not going to look at the nude at all. It is a nude descending. It is the act of descending that you see in this. Now, therefore, everything is in flux. Everything is changing. Nothing remains the same. So how can you look at something that is concretely available? There is nothing to look at that is concretely available. Everything is constantly transforming, and therefore all certainties are gone in this modern world. Nothing is certain. The human body is not certain. The figures are not certain. Our experiences are not certain. They are all in a kind of situation or condition of uncertainty, and that uncertainty affected not only society. Social organizations started changing. Society itself started transforming. Religion is no longer the same. The certainties of old religion have disappeared, and Christianity itself is called into question. Morality You don't know what is morality now. Morality has suddenly, taken a back seat. Nobody is worried about what is right and wrong anymore. What is right can be wrong and what is wrong can be right. And above all, the human self. Remember, the human self is now largely unconscious, not conscious. Now the unconscious human self that is not available is the central figure in modern literature. So the central figure in Ulysses, or the central figure in The Wasteland, the central figure in any of the modernist texts is not a completely available human being, but a human being in constant flux. A human being who is largely unconscious. If you have read The Wasteland, you might know Tiresias is supposed to be the hero. Can we call Tiresias the hero? I don't know. But Tiresias is at least the unifying consciousness in the poem. But how many times do you see Tiresias? Tiresias is present only once or twice as a kind of disembodied voice. Not exactly a human character at all. But Tiresias is supposed to organize all the human experiences. You can see how everything is in the unconscious. Everything is outside the purview of normal human experience. Everything is in process mode rather than completely, totally available. That kind of, putting something in process modes, putting something in flux, putting something in constant movement. That movement is what you saw in a painting like the nude descending the stair. It is an act of descent that is portrayed here, not the nude. If you are looking for the nude, your desire will be thwarted. What you have to look for is the act of descent itself. So if you are looking for the act of descent, well, it is portrayed there. So painting that is no longer talking about the nude, but talking about the action. Remember, this was also the time when people started representing action or trying to look for ways in which action could be represented in painting. Painting is typically frozen in time, but they were trying to capture time in painting which is otherwise frozen. Because remember, Gilles Deleuze, a very famous thinker of 20th century, said one of the characteristic features of the modern period is that it tries to portray time. Time is the mode of modern existence. Everything that is in product mode earlier, that was in product mode earlier, was now transformed into process mode. And when you try to capture a process, remember you are depicting, you are trying to portray time itself. So time is the hero here. Look at nude descending the stair. There is a time gap, a lapse, time lapse that is being portrayed here. Because the nude was standing at the top rung of the stair and then she must have walked down. And that period of time, it is completely depicted there. This is action that is portrayed in a period of time. That period, that time, that particular duration has suddenly become extremely significant for modernist literature. So time becomes suddenly the mode of experience, time becomes the mode of depiction that is important for modernist literature as a whole, and that's one reason why Deleuze was talking about how time is the mode of modern existence. He tries to talk about how movies, for example, Deleuze was talking about cinema, because this particular explanation comes in a book called Cinema 2, which was a sequel to, he wrote to Cinema 1. He described all the development of cinema into wonderful books called Cinema 1 and 2. And in Cinema 2 he talks about the time image. Cinema is time image. It captures time. And that's one reason why cinema is very, very different as an art form from other art forms. Now, look at this painting. Duchamp is actually trying to portray time. He is portraying time because there is a time sequence. There is a time when the nude was standing at the top rung of the stair and then gradually walking down. So there is a time lapse. It is this time that the painter is trying to capture. So, image in the modernist sense is a time image. It's no longer a static image. Image in the modernist sense is a time image. It tries to capture change of time. Change of time in the sense there is a period of time that is being depicted here. There is a period of time in which the nude starts from the top rung of the stair and gradually moves down. The whole movement is captured. But apart from the movement itself, remember, movement here is portrayed in terms of time, and therefore time becomes one of the most significant aspects of modernist writing, modernist literature as a whole, modernist cinema or whatever. So when you talk about 20th century, time is the hero. Everything else is subordinated to time, depiction of time. But remember, time is not something that can easily be depicted. You cannot depict time. You can probably depict it like, maybe like this, right? You can try to depict it like this. But what is it trying to say? Time is not concrete. Time is not something that is of specific shape. It's something that is fluid. The moment you look back at something, it's no longer the same, right? When you remember something, remember it's no longer the same. That's why the wasteland is about mixing memory and desire, right? It's about mixing memory and desire, because memory and desire are projections of time, one into the past and the other into the future, right? Desire is future memory, and memory is past desire. Okay. It's not very different. It's after all the same. Memory and desire. Memory is about the past. Desire is about future. It's one way of looking at time from the point of view of the present. When you look at time from the present, like Janus, the two-headed god, you can either look back, right? Janus is the reason why January has that name, right? Janus is the two-headed, two-faced god with two faces, one looking back and one looking forward, and that's the reason why the first month has the name of January, because January is the month that looks back at the previous year and looks forward at the next year, remember. So like Janus, you are looking back at your past, memory, and looking at your future, desire. So memory and desire are, in a way, when combined with your time of perception, which is the present, that is the whole time depicted in a single image. Mixing memory and desire, therefore, is Eliot's mode of depicting time. Time as an image of continuity. A continuum that starts from the past, follows through the present, and goes towards the future. So this present, this past, present, future, this time sequencing is precisely what Eliot is trying to talk about when he talks about memory and desire. So it's, in a way, a poem that tries to talk about how the past and the present constitute whatever fluid experience that you have and can be called the present. The present is a kind of very fluid experience, remember. It's not something that is final, because you don't know what is the present. There's a wonderful story written by Kamala Das in which, somebody falls into a well, and that person is trying to escape from the well. Then there is a root that is falling down, a root of a tree that is on the, somewhere up there. And he tries to climb up the root in order to escape from the well. Now a cobra starts ascending the root just behind him. When he is going up, the cobra is following him in order to bite him. And when he tries to reach the top of the well, when he is almost at the end of the well, there is a tiger that is waiting for him. Just to get out of the well so that he can be killed. So he's captured between the tiger and the cobra. But there is a tree, remember, that's the reason why there is a root. There is a tree, and on the tree there was a honeycomb. And out of this honeycomb, a drop of nectar, a drop of honey fell down and fell on his lips, and he licked and said, "Oh, how sweet." And Gamalada says, this is human life. Right? The past is following you like a cobra. The future is waiting for you like a tiger. And then a drop of honey falls on your, lips or your tongue or whatever. You lick it and say, "How sweet." That's all. That is time. Time is something that is captured in a way in the present. But remember, it's a very fluid experience of the past and the future. Time is something that is quite fluid. Look at the clocks. They are so fluid that they can lie like cloth on the branch of a very, very dry tree. Can lie on the floor, wherever. So you can see how suddenly the limb watches. The watches that are now fluid in their state, talks about time. The fluidity of time, the fluidity of human experience. So what I'm trying to say is, the wasteland talks about a kind of sensitivity, a kind of experience in which time is central to our significance, but at the same time is a very fluid experience, and therefore you cannot be very definite about it. It's something that you think is definite only for the time being, but when you perceive the past and when you look towards the future, remember they constitute a very complex image. An image that is not something that you can always understand very easily. That complexity of experience is the typical experience of the wasteland. Okay. This was a time when I'm not going to play the whole, all the slides, but just pass through some of them. Now, this was a time when Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche, famous philosopher, talked about morality and disjointed it from religion. Talked about morality as something that's very different from religion. The eternity of religion, it is human conception. Morality is now human conception, something that can change. Right? You can see how flux, change becomes one of the most important aspects of the thinking. Now, social organization was redefined by Karl Marx, roughly around the same time, mid-19th century. Now, the proletariat, every society is defined by a kind of struggle between two opposite maybe forces, whether you are talking about proletariat and the capitalist, or talking about the king and the subjects, or whatever. There are two different kinds of realities that constantly fight with each other. Now, Freud splintered the human self into the conscious and the unconscious. Now, quite a lot of yourself is something that you cannot understand because it is unconscious. It's not something that is perceivable. And remember, there is the conundrum of the self, because if you have actually recognized your unconscious, that means it is no longer unconscious. Right? The unconscious is, by definition, something that cannot be understood, defined. The moment you define the unconscious, it's no longer the unconscious, and therefore it is beyond all definition. That is one of the beauties of the concept. You can never teach it, because if you teach it, that means it is not it, something else. Right? Teachers are always saved by Freud. Narrative is something that suddenly took a great beating at this point of time, because narrative, remember, is something that unifies everything. And if there is no unity that you can talk about, then what is the unification of narrative that you can talk about? So narrative suddenly became broken down. Remember, modernist fiction suddenly thought about stream of consciousness. Poetry itself suddenly started, in a way non-narrative in its character. Traditional syntax was violated. Coherence was deliberately broken down. All conventional modes of describing character have been left behind. Characters are no longer round characters of E.M. Foster. E.M. Foster said characters have to be round or flat. Now, there is no question of characters being round or flat. Characters are only defined in time, and therefore there is no question of completely looking at them, perceiving them. No character is now available for complete perception. Peter Brooks writes about, not the dramatist, but Peter Brooks, the critic, writes about how the beginning of 20th century development of philosophies dislodged certainties and created a kind of radical discomfort and alienation of the human from its former image. Now the human being is no longer the former human being. He is somebody who is very different, right? You cannot look at the human being as a holistic body, a whole or anything like that. The human being is somebody who is broken up into small fragments. That fragmentation is what is very important. Ushering in the fragmentation and disillusionment. So fragmentation and disillusionment are two very defining aspects of modernist literature now. There was also this problem. There was a life for us up to the 19th century. People could talk about whole life. People could talk about the self, wasteland. Before writing the wasteland, obviously, even Eliot could sometimes write about complete human beings and so on. Think about Wordsworth, think about even people like Browning and others in the 19th century. They were all talking about whole human beings who actually existed as if they were completely available. But now, the human being is problematized. That person is no longer available. That person has suddenly disappeared and is in fragments. Fragmentation was political, philosophical and psychological. There was self-criticism. People were criticizing themselves, questioning themselves, talking about themselves as, something that didn't exist actually. Freedom of expression also caused freedom from oneself in a way. So selfhood was questioned. The conservatives who wanted some sense of the self tried to move back to colonialism, but unfortunately colonialism had already failed. Colonialism also had already got fragmented. So the colony had been lost, therefore you could not fall back into a political reality that existed back in the 19th century. It was no longer available. Everybody tried to change social order, but nothing happened. Things just fell apart. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. There is no center to hold all these experiences together. It was at this time that a writer called F.H. Bradley, a philosopher, talked about how reality is sentient experience, sense experience. Reality happens only within your senses. It's not out there. It's not something that you can experience in the actual world, but it is completely in your experience and in your sense experience. So Bradley represented reality as sentient experience, something that you get through the body, get through the five senses of the body, or the sixth sense if you want that. What is not sentient is therefore not real. And remember, F.H. Bradley was the person on whose philosophy Eliot wrote his dissertation. So he knew F.H. Bradley very, very closely because Eliot's dissertation was on F.H. Bradley, on the concept of, or the philosophy of F.H. Bradley. So obviously, Eliot was very closely associated with the ideas and, concepts of F.H. Bradley. This was the central idea and, central tenet in Bradley. You cannot distinguish me, the person, from what I experience. I am what I experience. There is no self, myself or whatever, no person outside my own experience. I am what I experience, rather than, an outside object. I am not a person, an outside object experiencing another experience, but I am part of that experience. The experience is what constitutes me. I do not exist. I exist only as long as I can experience something. That's the problem. Right? I do not exist for you if you do not look at me. Right? So my existence here is completely based on your perception of me at this particular point of time. Otherwise, I don't exist. Where do I exist? I exist in perception. I exist only as long as other people can perceive me, only as long as I can perceive myself in a mirror. Remember, you have never looked at yourself. Have any of you looked at yourself? Have you looked at yourselves? Can you see yourself? You cannot see yourself. You can see only your mirror image. Remember. We have never seen ourselves. നമ്മുടെ ശരീരം കണ്ടിട്ടില്ല, മുഖം കണ്ടിട്ടില്ല. എന്റെ കണ്ണ് പറിച്ച് പുറത്ത് വെച്ച് ഇങ്ങോട്ട് നോക്കിയാലേ എനിക്ക് എന്നെ കാണാൻ പറ്റുള്ളൂ. അങ്ങനെ ഒരു വഴി എൻ്റെ കയ്യിലില്ല. അതുകൊണ്ട് ഞാൻ കണ്ടിട്ടുള്ള ഞാൻ ഏതോ കണ്ണാടിക്കകത്തുള്ള ഓടിയതും വളഞ്ഞതും പൊഴിഞ്ഞതുമൊക്കെ ആയ ഞാനാണ്. ആ ഞാൻ മാത്രമേ, സത്യത്തിൽ ഞാൻ അതിസുന്ദരനാണ്, എനിക്കറിയാം. പക്ഷേ എന്റെ കണ്ണാടിയിൽ ഞാൻ കണ്ട ഞാൻ ഒട്ടും സുന്ദരനല്ല എന്നും എനിക്കറിയാം. പക്ഷെ കണ്ണാടിയിൽ മാത്രമേ ഞാനുള്ളൂ എന്നുള്ള ദരിദ്ര യാഥാർത്ഥ്യത്തിലാണ് ഞാൻ ജീവിക്കുന്നത്. Right? That is the poverty of my perception. I cannot live outside my own perception. I cannot live outside your perception. I am the sum total of perceptions in this world. And how I perceive myself, how I perceive, how other people perceive me, that is what constitutes me. Right? നിങ്ങളാണ് ഒരു അർത്ഥത്തിൽ എന്നെ ഉണ്ടാക്കുന്നത്. ഞാൻ എന്ന് പറയുന്ന ഞാൻ സ്വയം സൃഷ്ടിച്ച സ്വയംഭൂവായിട്ടുള്ള ഒരാളൊന്നുമല്ല, മറ്റുള്ളവരെല്ലാം കൂടി ചേർന്ന് സൃഷ്ടിച്ചതാണ്. ഇപ്പോഴും അങ്ങനെ തന്നെ സൃഷ്ടിക്കപ്പെട്ടുകൊണ്ടേ ഇരിക്കുന്നതുമാണ്. So until the time of death, you are being constituted and reconstituted by different levels of perception. So F.H. Bradley would tell you that you cannot distinguish this person, this self, from the experience of that self. It is the experience of that self that constitutes the self. The self is never outside the experience of the self, outside this perception. This is part of the problem that 20th century tried to negotiate in many ways, but could not fruitfully negotiate, fortunately. So, think about Wordsworth. Wordsworth walks through a field, looks at the world, perceives the world, and his perception organizes the world into a meaningful whole. And when on my couch I lie, in vacant or in perceived mood, these experiences can flash upon that inward eye and reconstitute the whole reality that is possible. So the way in which daffodils exist in this world can be defined by the way Wordsworth looks at the daffodils and how the daffodils are brought back into Wordsworth's memory by or when he lies on the couch in a vacant or pensive mood. So that reality, the reality that comes into being as a whole, as a continuous, complete whole, in the perception of the romantic poet, does not exist anymore, because perception is broken up. It is something that is diversified and broken up, fragmented. The human mind is now conscious and unconscious put together, and the unconscious cannot be known, and therefore whatever the unconscious perceives is beyond the capacity of the ordinary human being to understand. You are actually understanding a lot that you do not understand that you are understanding. Remember. Right. Have you ever thought what you remember is the only things that you have perceived? Definitely no. There are many things that are already in your brain, already in your mind, that can be brought back by occasional sometimes even terrible experiences. Joyce would call it epiphanic moments. Moments of epiphany that would bring back reality in a very new light. Because this was already there in your mind, but you never realized it was already there. Quite a lot of the experiences that you pass through are already stored in your memory, only that you are incapable of recollecting them because maybe the passkey for recollecting them is not given to you. It's almost like giving you a program without the passkey, right? The passkey, password is no longer with you, that's all. The moment you recoup the password, get it back, you can get back all your memory. Maybe it doesn't happen, but it can potentially be there. That unconscious, that large world of experience that lies hidden in your reality, that is something which definitely is a part of yourself, but unfortunately you cannot access it. So, can you know yourself? That is a question that 20th century asked. Is there a way in which I can know myself? Do I know myself? Actually no, because if you know yourself completely, that means you are a person without an unconscious. And all human beings have an unconscious, therefore, if you do not have an unconscious, you cannot be a person at all. So you are a person who is non persona grata, so therefore you do not exist. If you want to exist, part of you should not be available to you. If the whole of you is available to you, that means you do not exist anymore. That's why death is the mother of beauty in Wallace Stevens. Death is the mother of beauty because it's only by dying that you can make something whole. Otherwise it is constantly changing. It's constantly being recreated, remember. Now look at all the art experiences of 20th century, whether we are talking about surrealism, expressionism, or let's say Vorticism, Cubism, right? Surrealism was Salvador Dali, you have already seen it. Expressionism, person like Edward Munch, for example, Dadaism, or Cubism, you have already seen the three musicians. Vorticism, again, Pound was a great master of Vorticism. He tried to bring Vorticism into poetry. Futurism, all these are paintings or schools of painting that emerged in the 20th century. For them, images resembled dream imagery. And what is special about dream? Remember, dream is that occasional access that you get to your unconscious. Right? Dream is that occasional access. Dream is the only possibility of accessing your unconscious, because that is the time when your conscious mind sleeps and your subconscious is wakeful, and your subconscious brings a little bit of the unconscious into play, and you can definitely get a sense of the unconscious through dream. So dream imagery, if you analyze dream imagery, you can see how dream imagery tries to access a world that is otherwise hidden from you. It's the hidden world of the unconscious, because some of the desires of the unconscious get attached to images of the subconscious and come back into the human mind during times of sleep. Sleep is a time when your guards are down, and obviously your subconscious is very light. And during that period of time, some of the images in the subconscious can carry images in the unconscious, and therefore if you interpret dream imagery, you might be getting a kind of understanding of the unconscious, even though it is partial. You cannot have complete understanding of the unconscious. And T.S. Eliot tries to write the wasteland, remember, he is trying to access the unconscious through imagery that sounds almost like dream imagery. That is a kind of technique that these writers use. Fragmentation becomes the mode of perception here. There was no technique available, so they went back to narrative. The Wasteland is the shortest narrative epic poem in English literature, remember. 433, 34, 35. You can choose as you like. Maybe 434 lines in our count, 33 in Eliot's count, whatever. Now, it's very short, but at the same time, remember it's an epic poem. How does it begin? It begins by upending, destroying, questioning the first major epic poet in English, Geoffrey Chaucer. April is the cruelest month. When that April with his shoulder suit has been transformed into April is the cruelest month. Now, April is the cruelest month because it can mix memory and desire. It can still stir dull roots with spring rain. It's a period of spring, and there is spring rain, and spring rain can bring back life into the world. It is spring rain that pierces to the root, and the roots are then obviously kind of brought back to life during spring, during April. That's the reason why April is cruel. Why? Because for the ordinary wastelander, April is a cruel month because it is a time when they are reborn. There is a possibility of rebirth. Rebirth is something that they are afraid of. Right? So April is the cruelest month. See how Eliot takes a poem written by a great master who is probably the father of English poetry. I don't know whether he was himself the father. We haven't heard of other fathers, but there are a couple of other fathers available, I think. But anyway, he is supposed to be the father of English poetry, and here is a poet who is taking the father and in a singular act of parricide destroys the father's first lines and writes about something that changes the tradition as a whole. So that parricidal act, that very parricidal act is an act of a child beating against, or rather fighting against, the father. The father of English poetry is thoroughly destroyed because the son wanted to establish himself as a poet. Right? April is the cruelest month. Reading lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain. But remember, this was also about all the seasons at the same time, because summer surprised us coming over the Starnberger Sea with a shower of rain. You can see how rain continues to be a constant image, but rain that is unwelcome because it is rain that will pierce to the root. You don't want a rain because rain is something that you try to escape from. A closed car at 10, remember. You close your car so that rain doesn't fall in, because you're afraid of the water, rainwater. Rainwater is something that will rejuvenate you, bring you back to life. You don't want to be brought back to life because death is comfortable. Death is more comfortable. 20ാം നൂറ്റാണ്ടിന്റെ കവി മലയാളത്തിൽ പറയും, വെളിച്ചം ദുഃഖമാണുണ്ണി, തമസല്ലോ സുഖപ്രദം. എലിയറ്റിനെ സംബന്ധിച്ചിടത്തോളം ജീവൻ ദുഃഖമാണ്, മരണമല്ലോ സുഖപ്രദം. That's what happens. Death is something that's more welcome. And the moment water comes in, water, remember, is the life-giving element in the wasteland. The moment water comes in, seeps through the soil and arrives at that buried root, the dead and buried root, obviously there is a possibility of rejuvenation, and all rebirth is dangerous as far as the wastelanders are concerned. Because this is a time when death is more comfortable. This is a time when they don't want to be reborn, they don't want to remember, they don't want to come back, they don't want to be alive, because life for them means walking round and round in a ring. Remember, life is just a walking round and round in a ring, and they don't want to be caught up in this senseless walk round and round in a ring, and therefore they're more comfortable in death. One of the anxieties of the wasteland is whether the dog that is friend to man is likely to, take the buried root out, bring it back to life, right? Keep the dog far hence, that is friend to man, or with its nails it will dig it up again, right? You don't want the roots to come back to life. That's the reason why the dog is a dangerous animal. Originally it was a wolf, remember? But in the wasteland it's a dog. The dog is a dangerous animal because it's likely to dig the root back to life. And anything that will bring life back into the wasteland is dangerous, whether it's water or the door. It's something that you fear. The wastelanders normally fear. So you can see how all these experiences talk about how death is comfortable, experience of life is dangerous. They are not welcome. Those experiences are not welcome anymore in this world. Why? Because for them, life was painful as an experience of fragmentation. This lack of unity. Towards the end of the poem, the poet asks the very, very important question in the poem: shall I at least set my lands in order? So this desire for order, this desire for some kind of a meaning, some kind of an organizing sensibility is what the poet is constantly worried about, the wastelanders are worried about, but unfortunately for them, this experience doesn't exist. The experience of unity is something that has completely disappeared from the world. So, in a way, the wasteland is about, on the one hand, how the people want to stay on, continue to be in a state of stupor, a state of, let us say, death. But at the same time, it's also about how we should desire rebirth. So this desire for rebirth, this desire, shall I at least set my lands in order? This desire for order, for birth, for some kind of a defining experience is part of the underlying desire of the poem. The poem itself is painfully aware of the disjointed nature of human existence, but at the same time, it is also constantly asking for, desirous of unity. It knows that there is no unity, but remember, this is not a poem that loves that disjointed character. It does not want disunity. The poem does not want fragmentation. The poem wants unity. It wants to do away with the fragmentation, wants to get back some kind of an order in some way or other. In this way, it's different from postmodernism. Postmodernism would celebrate fragmentation. It would be happy about lack of unity. Postmodernism would say, well, I am not a single unified self, therefore I can have as many experiences as possible, and those experiences define me in certain, different ways at every moment of perception, and therefore I am happy in my own plurality. Whereas this is a text that is not happy about plurality. The Wasteland is a text that is anxious about plurality, that is anxious about fragmentation, it's anxious and worried about the fact that you cannot have a single unified self. It wants that single unified self. So the desire of the Wasteland is not for fragmentation, it's against fragmentation. It's a desire for unification, a unified sensibility, even though it's painfully aware of the fact that in the modern world that unification is not easily available. So it's still a kind of dirge of, it's about the depth of unity, but at the same time it's also a request for unification that the poet is constantly trying to achieve. I'm just running through this, I'm not going to read the whole of it. So one thing that you have noticed is, how do you think about this fragmentation? You think about fragmentation using a narrative that is also fragmented. You cannot have a whole complete narrative in order to talk about fragmentation. That will be very ironic. So you fragment the narrative itself. You break down the structure of the narrative. By breaking down the structure of the narrative, by breaking down narrative tendencies and strategies themselves, you try to tell the people, or rather tell yourself, that I am no longer a unified narrative, but I want to be a unified narrative. So narrative is the hero of the Wasteland, not Tiresias. Remember, it's not Tiresias who is the hero of the narrative, the poem. It is narrative that is the hero of the Wasteland. The Wasteland is about how narration is broken down. The Wasteland is about how the narrative is no longer available, And the wasteland is a desire for that narrative. Shall I at least set my lands in order can otherwise be read as, shall I at least tell my story? Can I at least tell my story in a whole manner? Can there be a holistic structure for my story? Is there a possibility of my story to be my story instead of my story being the story of all these other people, all those women, remember, all those women and men who are different figures, but at the same time somehow they all congeal into one subjectivity, one person within the consciousness of Tiresias. Right? So Tiresias is the figure that characteristically becomes the central consciousness of the poem, but at the same time, remember, Tiresias is not all the other people. Tiresias is only somebody who tries to gather all these other people into his own consciousness. And Tiresias is not even he is both he and she at the same time. Remember, he is somebody who had already had a female existence, and therefore he is both male and female, he is both living and dead. He has been in this world and in hell at the same time, and therefore Tiresias is of two worlds, and in that sense becomes the unifying sensibility that painfully tries to make sense out of a fragmented and nonsensical world. So this desire to narrate, desire to tell the story, desire to birth a human being who is complete and whole in itself. This desire to have one's self is the constant desire that characterizes the wasteland as a poem. The poem is therefore a continuation of the romantic self, not a radical break from it. Do not think of modernism as a radical break, whatever Peter Brooks said. Whatever all those early critics tried to say, remember that modernism is not a radical break from romanticism, it's only another way of looking at romanticism. Romanticism thought there was holistic self. Modernism knew that self was not available, but presented that self as the constant desire in the poem. So the self is there. The holistic, complete self is there. Now, it's not completely available. It's in a broken up and fragmented, kind of reality. But at the same time, it is there as a desire, a possibility. It is there as a future. That self is, that complete self is in the future of the wasteland. Once you complete the wasteland, that future self is available. The complete, total self is available. That's the reason why you can end the poem with the line Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. There is a Shanti that is possible. What is that Shanti? The Shanti is available when you escape from fragmentation. Once you escape from fragmentation, once you escape from this broken up reality, you will end up in a peace, a kind of spiritual peace that is in a way available only to a unified soul. That peace available only to a unified soul is the ultimate desire of the poem. It's a dream that it constantly tries to live by, and the last image that it wants to leave in your mind. Right? Therefore, at the end of the poem, you have these three major qualities of the human mind: Dept, Dayatvam, and Damyata. Right? Try to give, because you are after all very selfish. Right? Dharma, try to control, because basically you are all without control, self-control. And Dayatva, be compassionate, because you are likely to be very cruel. So the experience of the human self as a complete reality, something that Brihadaranyaka Upanishad tried to present to you, that experience of the whole holistic soul, the complete soul, the total soul that could experience the world as a single reality and whole is possible in the wasteland. It's possible, and that's the reason why the poem can end with the chant Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. The Shanti, the peace, comes only from an escape from spiritual disquietude, only from a spiritual brokenness, It comes only from spiritual unity that Eliot was constantly trying to achieve. In that sense, remember, Eliot's poem is not exactly the poem of future. It is a poem of the past. It is a poem that developed into more modern English poetry. It's a poem that talked constantly about past poetry. It's about the old world. It's about the world that has already started disappearing. In a few years' time, maybe in 10 or 15 years' time, people will start talking about the pleasure of brokenness. They will talk about the pleasure of fragmentation. They will wallow in many, in multitude of selfhood and so on. Because postmodernity, remember, is just around the corner. The doors are already open. Postmodernity is just out there. And automatically, a very different reality, a broken up reality that is also very pleasant is just around the corner. But the wasteland is not about that world. It is not about that reality. It is about a reality that is gradually going out of the door. It's about a reality that is whole, complete, total. It's a reality that probably people do not want to talk about anymore, but it's a reality that they still desire, probably because it is their past anyway. So it's this reaccessing of the past, going back into the past, whether it's in the form of the Bible or the Tempest or let's say Chaucer or any of the poets like Baudelaire or any of them whom Eliot constantly talks about. It is about how reaccessing the past is the only way in which you can come to terms with the future. So the important premise upon which the wasteland rests is that reaccessing the past is the only way in which you can actually come to terms with the future. But this future would be dead in a matter of a decade. This would be probably unseated by postmodernism, by post-structuralism and all the kinds of new tendencies that would crop up 10 or 15 years later, remember. But the wasteland still remains important because at this very threshold of postmodernism, it tries to talk about the anxieties of the modern man using a discourse that is more comfortable with 19th or 18th century literary language. So that accessing of the past is still made possible by the wasteland. That is the reason why the wasteland still remains a seminal text, a very important text. Well, if I talk like this, I can go on talking for hours, and I know that you have already started mixing your memory with desire, and I hope the memories will not be too dangerous, and the desire will not be one to get out of the class at the earliest. Even that desire also is very good. But remember, when you read a poet like Eliot, one of the things you have to remember is that Eliot is a person who constantly tried to dramatize himself. He tried to put himself in so many of his characters and dramatize himself. He is a person who tried to write about himself as if he was writing about somebody else. Because remember, he tried to bring objectivity into poetry and could at the same time remember that ultimate objectivity is in the subjectivity of the poet. So the objectivity that Eliot tries to talk about is in making his subject objective. Right? The subjective element is forcibly transformed into an objective element. The personal is transformed into the impersonal. Then we try to quote that part. Right? Poetry becomes impersonality not because it is impersonality per se, but because it is impersonality that is a very differently couched form of personality. It's an escape from personality that is constantly anxious and worried about the personality it is escaping from. When you try to escape something, remember, you are constantly worried about it. Have you ever tried to escape an elephant? Imagine the next time when you are caught in front of an elephant and you are trying to escape from it. Will you think about the future or will you think about the elephant that is pursuing you? Obviously, all your thoughts will be about the elephant, the past, what is behind you. Remember? So when you try to escape from personality, that personality becomes the elephant that pursues you. Obviously, therefore, for a person like T.S. Eliot, personality was very, very important. However objectified it was, however he tried to objectify it, impersonify it, however he tried to escape from it, he was not somebody to escape from it, but somebody who constantly went back into it and dramatized it in order to make it the central locus of his writing. Thank you very much.